So hi everybody, welcome back after the summer. I hope you had a good one. I'm happy to be back with part 4 of the Jung Talks, which will be a bit theoretical in this case because I will be investigating the further topic of the essential dignities, or rather perhaps the mystery of the essential dignities and how they were represented in traditional astrology, but specifically the Hellenistic version of traditional astrology. So let's have a look. So again, what is the function of these separate dignities? And in this video, I will be presenting something on an issue that was mentioned by Robert Schmidt, but before him, it was also mentioned by James Holden. And this has to do with some important and perhaps some explosive material from Robert Schmidt having to do with the difference between what we now call a significator, a dispositor, and a ruling planet, because these functions need to be distinguished to be able to exactly determine what they are all about. So let's have a look at that. So yeah, this is about Mr. Ptolemy, Claudius Ptolemy, and the expletive deleted is damn Ptolemy, or even worse. As Schmidt said, I want to talk about what I regard as the most calamitous event that ever befell the Western astrological tradition, and this was something that Ptolemy is responsible for. I will explain this. But this was also addressed by James Holden in this book, A History of Horoscopic Astrology, with a foreword in which he really destroys the idea that Ptolemy was the most important, or perhaps the important astrologer to follow, because a lot of his material was really not in accord with the Hellenistic tradition in that sense. So that's something I want to address now in how Schmidt talked about it. But it's a very interesting point, because Ptolemy had a lot of influence on the medieval tradition which followed him, and that was really in a sense to the detriment of some of the Hellenistic material. So let's have a look at that. So this is what Schmidt said about book 3 of the Tetrabiblos of Ptolemy, and there he lays out what he calls his general investigation into topical matters. And before he says what his approach will be, he criticizes, and according to Schmidt more than criticizes, says that he's going to reject the ancient method of prediction, which will turn out to be the Hellenistic method. So what is that? What it's all about? Well, Schmidt said that Ptolemy ignores entirely the analysis of this ancient method of prediction and focuses entirely on what he called the so-called ruling planets, and singling out that planet which has the most authority over that place, which we now call the Almuten, which is of course the word for victor. And Ptolemy continuing his analysis solely in terms of that ruling planet. So, and the other interesting thing is that this is the planet that Ptolemy calls the Archidespotes, which is of course a conflagration of the term simply because it's used in other contexts as well. So Ptolemy is responsible for that. Now, these ruling planets of Ptolemy, I believe, says Schmidt, could be without qualification be called dispositors, because they are settling the issue relative to the significator entirely according to their own conditions. So that's a bit of a confusion, perhaps simply because Ptolemy wrote in this fashion, and this is repeated in all the tradition after him. Especially the medieval tradition. So that's quite something we need to address to clarify what these terms actually signify in relation to what the ancient method of prediction said about it. So let's have a look at what Ptolemy actually did. He did two things. He declared all the essential dignities as being dispositors, and he declared everything in a chart as being significators, to be judged by means of all their dispositors, which is something that Robert Zoller taught in his class on medieval astrology, which is excellent, by the way, and he declared everything as being judging this also by means of their almuten, which is the medieval method, of course. So all the planets, each of the 12 topical places and all the lots can be delineated by means of this method that Ptolemy propounded. But and it's interesting because he only used a lot of fortune when we're talking about lots, so that's also pretty interesting. And there is a confusion about the difference between a significator, a dispositor, and a ruling planet because of this exceptional influence that Ptolemy had on the later tradition. So he effectively buried the ancient method, which is actually the Hellenistic system of delineating charts, and he shut the door practically to the examination of that original Hellenistic system. So, well, yeah, that's a pity, but let's have a look at what this might suggest for how we do astrology nowadays. So let's have a look at the ancient method of prediction, which is basically the Hellenistic Greek method of prediction, rather not necessarily prediction, but rather chart evaluation and delineation. And this distinguishes between universal principles and specific inquiries. So the question also then is, what is a significator as viewed from this ancient method of prediction? Well, the universal inquiries that Schmidt encountered in the ancient texts were these, which are now rather familiar, I think. The first one is called the domicile master of the nativity, which is the lord of the nativity, the domicile master of the predominating light, which is called the oikodespotes. And the important thing is that this is a planet that takes the entire nativity as its domicile or as its home. So it's a pretty general principle of signification. And we can say that the sect light, which determines this domicile master, is the significator of that issue. The second one, also encountered in my videos and in other material, is the trigon lord of the sect light, which has to do first with life as a whole, dividing it in two parts, a first half and a second half, which addresses the general ups and downs of the overall fate in relation to happiness and success, and B, it determines the rank of the nativity. So you can say that the triplicity rulers are the significators of these two investigations. Okay, that's the second one. There's another one, the lord of the confines of the predominator for the determination of the length of life. And we do this with the giver of life, which is called the high leg. And the high leg is therefore the significator of the length of life investigation. So the very important thing to conclude about this is that these are all used in universal inquiries that have to do with life as a whole. The entire life of the native is determined somehow in a specific way by means of these systems of investigation. So these are the universal inquiries, and there might be some more, but these are the ones that most people know about. So in the context of universal inquiries, these are not used in the context of the investigation of specific individual topics as we do with, for instance, the 12 places, the 12 houses of the natal chart. So that's quite a difference. And these methods look at the chart from one single perspective in order to read the entire life of the native from that one perspective alone. So the reason why this is important is that there's quite a difference in how then the chart will function when any of these principles, universal investigations, point in a certain direction. And one of them is very important because Valens mentions this somewhere in his anthology, where he says that whenever a person is of high rank or has a great support in the natal chart for eminence, then the the malefics and the benefics work in a different way for such a person. So whenever someone has a very high rank in his chart indicated, then the malefics will not per se or perhaps have a malefic effect on the life of the person we're talking about, but it's averted somehow to people in his environment or her environment, which is quite something to say. When you do not know the rank of the nativity, then you're not quite sure how the malefics will and the benefics will function in this chart, whether they affect the native personally or whether they affect persons in the environment of this native. So that's quite an interesting thing to be able to determine, right? So yeah, that's important. So we're talking about significators. So as said, Ptolemy altered this ancient method. He actually simply denies it or uses it as a specific topical investigation, which it is not. And this method of Ptolemy is nowadays also done for the plethora of new factors introduced in a chart, even traditional ones. So people trying to delineate 12 parts in this way, decans in this way, etc., etc. So we need to make a distinguish. We need to distinguish between what is indicated by what we're talking about, and Ptolemy merely throws it all in one heap and then you start delineating it. So to make the point clear, the significator, as shown in these three universal investigations as I've shown here, need to fulfill certain qualifying conditions, but this planet itself is not delineated. It merely points to something. So look there for this investigation. So in the first one, the domicile master of the nativity, it is the sect light which points you in the direction of the planet that will have the role of the oikodespotes. So please understand this, because that's quite a difference. Why is this important? I will show you. I will make you see what the difference is and how this can be used in delineation. So again, the significator is sort of a pointing stick. It points to a certain chart factor used to be used for evaluation of this universal inquiry, and the evaluation we do with the dispositor of that significator. Now, what's interesting is that what happens a lot is quite often that this pointing device, the significator itself, is delineated quite extensively, and this is probably due to a misunderstanding of the principles of this ancient method, or because of too much Ptolemy. And why is this a problem? Because of this, because this is a bit like confusing the condition of the sign of, for instance, a street or a town or a village with the place itself. So that is like saying, well, I'm not going there because look at the state it's in, and you judge the state it's in by means of the sign of the planet. So because, for instance, Moab has a lot of stickers on it, then you misunderstand it as having a sort of a lot of aspects with the significator, which is pretty silly. The action town has some bullet holes in it, so you perhaps think this is a very dangerous place, and Chisel Green, this street, looks also a bit disheveled, so I'm not going there. Look at the state it's in. Well, then you're simply misunderstanding the difference between the sign that points to something and the planet you use to try to evaluate what's actually going on there. So that is that's a pretty serious mistake to make, I think. So what then happens is that we confuse the sign or the significator with the thing itself, and that's not a good idea, right? Okay, so then we need to try to establish what a dispositor is then. And that's quite simple. The dispositor is a planet used to judge the issue that the significator points to. And in the ancient text, this is also often called the ruler of the ruler, which is also applied to some other considerations, but this is a very important idea to take into account. So it is this planet, the dispositor, whose condition is evaluated to generate a delineation for the universal inquiry. It decides something about the significator of which it is the dispositor. Okay, there's also an important proviso that the influence of Ptolemy's method has all but erased, and that is the fact that these Hellenistic methods, where the word dispositor is used in a specific way, all have to do with the life as a whole, making statements about the entirety of the life of the native, summation statements. So let's call them the broad strokes, and perhaps then we need to alter our terminology, and we need to use the term universal significators for the issues of the ancient method of prediction having to do with the life in general, or the broad strokes of the life of the native. And that's quite a difference, of course. So these universal investigations are not about topical inquiries as per the 12 places, the 12 houses or the planets or anything of the kind, and Ptolemy's method became dominant and thus obscured this difference, and he made his topical approach pertain to universal inquiries as well. But Schmidt said, well, the significator as a universal significator is addressed to the life as a whole. Well, of course we're not going to mix the significations of the dispositor with the universal signification of the significator. That would not make logical sense in his mind. So we need to distinguish between these factors and in that sense reject Ptolemy's method. Again, what is the or a ruling planet? Let's listen to what Schmidt said about it. He said, I said earlier that these are the only two relationships in which a delineation that involves significations of the two planets is in fact generated in all of our source texts. And this means that a delineation can be generated even when the Lord, the domicile Lord, or the Lord of the confines is not present in the sign that is its domicile, or in the region of a sign that is in fact its confines. So the ruling planet can be either the domicile lord of a planet in a certain image, and it is the confine lord of a planet in a certain region of an image. So that's quite important, simply because these are the only two relationships that can be found to have specific delineation recipes and suggestions in the ancient text. So the other ones are never used in this sense, as I pointed out in the previous video, I believe. So the significator function is different from what happens if planets start combining, mixing their significations, as is done per the dispositor in the ancient texts. So the Greek word for that mixing, that mixture, is krasis and sunkrasis, which according to the textual evidence is only done in the case of the domicile master and the bound lord. And again, very important, the domicile master nor the bound lord need to be at home to generate these delineations, so they can be absent from their own place. As in oikeiosis, images have adopted and assimilated, brought into the household, have familiarized themselves with the characteristics of the domicile master, and vice versa. So that's the reason why the aversion of the domicile ruler, for instance, doesn't impede or interfere with what its image produces for a guest. So you can simply delineate the principles of the domicile master in accord with the planet that is visiting or is the guest in the image, that generates a delineation as we are actually acquainted with in our own methods and the methods that you probably have learned in your early training as an astrologer, simply because the domicile master also has acquainted itself with the image of which it is the domicile master, and vice versa. So again, the domicile master need not be present in its own image to be able to generate such a delineation. And we will see that it's also the bound lord which need not be in its own confine to generate the signification that it has for a planet. So again, pretty impressive material, impressive research by Mr. Schmidt. So let's have a look further into these matters. So let's have an evaluation of all these principles. So the dispositor is the ruling planet, and it's differentiated from the word significator. The significator points to a certain principle or topic, and the dispositor is used to evaluate the condition or whatever needs to be said about the significator. But please remember, the word significator, as I explained it here, is also often called the dispositor. And even Schmidt does that in this quote. With this distinction in mind, at long last I think I fully understand this distinction between a true dispositor and a planet that has some responsibility relative to another planet in generating delineations, as for instance when a planet is in the domicile or the confines of another planet. So there you have it. And so we need to look at the domicile masters of images, which are given here as per the scheme of the Thema Mundi. These are the planets that need not be present in their own images to be able to generate delineations for certain planets visiting in these images. And the same goes for the bound lords of the confine lords, or whatever name you want to use, but do not use the term for these principles, because that's rather a silly indication for what a bound lord actually signifies. And for that I always use the Egyptian versions, the Egyptian bounds according to Dorotheus of Sidon. But as you can see, there are different schemes for that, but this is the one that I use, and there's a very interesting principle behind it. So this is the recapitulation of all this material. Please read it at your leisure. You can see what specifically are the differences and how Schmidt approached this, and you can study this on your own time and read them carefully and try to follow what this is saying about all these different terms: the significator, the dispositor, which is actually the ruling planet, and the word dispositor is also often used for what we now have understood to be a significator. So understand these differences and take them into account. So now we can look at the chart of Mr. Jung and have a scheme of principles, planets that really can generate delineations for his natal planets. As you can see the listing here, and these can generate delineations, but we can have a look at them again. The only planet that we can now locate as a planet that is rejoicing, which is the moon, which is in its own exaltation. And as Schmidt said, there are no texts to be found that generate delineations for planets in the exaltation of other planets, and it merely indicates that the planets that are in the exaltation are enjoying themselves, they rejoice. And that's quite a difference from trying to delineate what it means for a planet being exalted by another planet, etc. That's quite a difference with how it's now done in natal analysis. But we, of course, need to understand what it actually is, what the bounds actually do, simply because we now know, and I've explained it in previous videos, that the domicile master, the domicile ruler, being the host of a visiting planet, has a very specific meaning for that, and now we need to try to understand what the bounds indicate and what the ruler of the confines produces for a planet that is in its confines. So that's an interesting investigation. And I will address this issue in my next video, so I hope you enjoyed this one, or perhaps you hated it because it might fly into your face as being quite different from how you were taught ancient astrology, but this is the Hellenistic version, so we need to try to understand and come to grips with what these differences mean, because you cannot add up all these different functions that planets have with each other simply because the ancient material does not provide examples, for instance, for planets being in the exaltation of another planet, or being a triplicity ruler for another planet, etc. That this was not addressed. And it also suggests that these were not used in the sense that we have learned in the medieval astrology or other traditions. So, well, when we take that into account, perhaps this leads to some specific ideas and perhaps some insight into what it actually might mean in your chart. So I'm hoping to address this in the next one, which will be about the confines. So, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time when I will address the issue of the bounds, the ruler of the confines, which Schmidt called the real rulers of planets when there are planets in the bounds of other planets. So that's quite interesting, and we will address this and we'll try to use it and give examples of it in the case of Mr. Jung. Again, if you have any use for these videos and would like to contribute to the growth of my channel, please feel free to contribute financially, but also kind words and comments and the like are also pretty welcome. So thank you again. Have a look at the next videos for the advertisement of my practical astrology, in the sense of consultations that you can do, and an endorsement of one of them by one of my clients, which was very kind of him to allow me to publish here. So thanks again, and see you next time. Of course, I also do natal chart delineations. They are all based on these Hellenistic principles, simply because, as you can here when you listen to these videos, I have done quite some research into all this material and trying to understand how you can use it in natal charts. So that might be a surprise for your own chart whenever you have it delineated in this way. So it's an in-depth study of your chart, etc. So if you please feel free to contact me if you are interested in such a delineation. So I would like to do that for you, and hope you will enjoy them as much as I do.